Imagine you are deep asleep at 4 in the morning, and in less than 2 minutes, the building around you collapses into rubble. That was the reality for more than 11 million people across 11 provinces of southern Turkey and northern Syria on the morning of February 6, 2023. More than 59,000 people lost their lives, equivalent to wiping out the entire population of a mid-sized Vietnamese province in a matter of seconds. This was the deadliest earthquake in the modern history of Turkey and the worst natural disaster recorded across the Middle East in more than 1 century. Scientists had known this fault would rupture within the next 100 years, but nobody expected it to happen on that particular night. But to understand why a land inhabited for thousands of years became so catastrophically fragile, we need to look far beneath the surface. Turkey sits on one of the most tectonically complex regions on Earth, where 3 major plates, the Eurasian, Arabian, and Anatolian, grind relentlessly against each other every single day. The East Anatolian Fault stretches approximately 500 kilometers from the Gulf of Iskenderun on the Mediterranean coast all the way to Lake Van in the east, accumulating stress for hundreds of years without release. The last time this fault released energy on a major scale was in 1939, and ever since, the pressure building beneath the surface had never ceased accumulating. Kahramanmaraş, a city of 1 million people, sitting precisely at the junction of 2 fault branches, had grown rapidly in recent decades, with thousands of high-rise apartment blocks constructed at speed. Many of these buildings were constructed with substandard concrete, inadequate steel reinforcement, and critically, without compliance with the seismic building codes that the Turkish government had mandated since 2007. On the night of February 5th, temperatures dropped below -3 degrees Celsius, and most residents had gone to bed early to escape the biting winter cold of southeastern Turkey. Less than 200 kilometers to the south, in the city of Aleppo in Syria, just beginning to recover from more than 10 years of civil war, millions were also sleeping in buildings already weakened by years of bombardment. That was the setting of that night. A region as vast as central Vietnam, with tens of millions of people lying on top of a geological time bomb that had been counting down for 80 years. And then at exactly 4:17 in the morning of February 6th, at the junction of 2 fault branches, 18 kilometers beneath Pazarkent district, 80 years of accumulated strain began to release. The fault ruptured in both directions simultaneously at approximately 3 kilometers per second, faster than sound travels through air, tearing open a surface rupture more than 300 kilometers long. The energy released in that single moment was equivalent to approximately 500 atomic bombs of the type dropped on Hiroshima, all detonating simultaneously beneath the ground. Seismic waves traveled at several kilometers per second, and within less than 1 minute, they had reached Gaziantep, Şanlıurfa, Adıyaman, Malatya, and dozens of other cities within a 300-kilometer radius. In Kahramanmaraş, the ground shook violently for approximately 60 seconds, with peak ground acceleration exceeding 1 g, meaning the Earth was being thrown upward with more force than gravity itself. Try to picture this differently. If you had been standing on that ground at that moment, your feet would have been lifted off the surface, and everything around you would have collapsed in the very same instant. Non-compliant concrete buildings collapsed in the pancake mode, each floor dropping straight down onto the one below, with no time to create any survival void for the people inside. Within less than 2 minutes, more than 6,000 buildings had completely collapsed in Kahramanmaraş province alone, and that number would continue to climb throughout the hours ahead. About 130 kilometers to the southwest of the epicenter, the ancient city of Antakya in Hatay province, once the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, was almost entirely leveled. Antakya was home to one of the oldest urban civilizations in the world, with a recorded history spanning more than 2,300 years, and within less than 1 minute, much of that heritage was gone. This was not merely a geological event. This was the moment a 2,000-year-old city lost most of its history. In the very same instant, it lost the people living within it. Simultaneously, across the border, the city of Aleppo in Syria received ground shaking of approximately 0.3 G, enough to bring down thousands of buildings already weakened by years of war damage. In Syria's Idlib province, where more than 4 million displaced people were living in temporary tent camps and damaged concrete shelters, the seismic waves arrived in the dead of night and took everything they had left. The power grid across 11 Turkish provinces went dark almost immediately, and millions of survivors were suddenly surrounded by darkness, sub-zero temperatures, and the rubble of the buildings around them. The telecommunications network collapsed as cell towers were destroyed, and millions of people tried to call simultaneously, leaving survivors unable to reach family members or call for rescue. Think about what happens when not just your home, but the hospitals, the roads, and the entire infrastructure of a million-person city all disappear in the same morning. 3 of the 4 largest hospitals in Hatay province were severely damaged or completely destroyed, at the exact moment when hundreds of thousands of people lay buried in rubble and urgently needed emergency surgery. Hatay Airport was rendered non-operational as its runway cracked apart, while the main highway connecting the region to the rest of Turkey was blocked at hundreds of points by landslides and road collapses. In that darkness, at -3 degrees Celsius, survivors began digging with their bare hands in the night, without equipment, without guidance, driven only by the instinct of family members searching for family members. Sub-zero temperatures became the second enemy after the earthquake itself, as people trapped beneath the rubble were suffering from both crushing injuries and hypothermia simultaneously. 9 hours after the first strike, at 13:24 in the afternoon, the earth shook again at 7.7 magnitude, with the new epicenter near Elbistan district 90 kilometers north of the original rupture. This second earthquake of 7.7 magnitude, in any other circumstance, would have been a historic catastrophe in its own right. But it struck a region that had already been completely destroyed since morning. Buildings being excavated for survivors collapsed a second time, burying both the trapped victims and the people attempting to rescue them beneath fresh layers of concrete. In the city of Adıyaman, where nearly the entire urban core had collapsed, rescue teams were trying to locate signs of life beneath millions of tons of concrete without adequate detection equipment. In that city of 300,000 people, without electricity, without communication, without functioning hospitals, thousands of people began lighting fires in the streets to survive the night. In Malatya province, where more than 12,000 buildings were destroyed, most of the surviving population had to sleep in cars, warehouses, and outdoors on the very first night because there was nowhere left to shelter. Meanwhile, across the border, the situation in Syria was even more complicated because the country had no unified government, no intact relief infrastructure, and was isolated by international sanctions. In Jandaris, a small town in northwestern Syria, more than 80% of buildings collapsed, and most residents were refugees who had already been displaced multiple times across 10 years of civil war. The Syria civil defense teams, known as the White Helmets, were the first and in many cases the only responders present at collapse sites across northwestern Syria in those critical first hours. During the first 48 hours, the window that rescue experts call the golden phase, every hour that passed significantly reduced the survival probability for those still trapped beneath the rubble. But snow began to fall on the second day after the disaster, blanketing the rubble fields white and further slowing rescue operations already severely hampered by the total collapse of road infrastructure. 84 countries sent rescue teams, including more than 10,000 international relief personnel, but most of them took 2 to 3 days to reach the most severely affected areas. Specialized urban search and rescue teams from Japan, South Korea, Israel, and the European Union brought acoustic sensors, thermal cameras, and probe robots to locate living survivors deep within the concrete darkness. And while miraculous rescues did occur even after 120, 180, and even more than 240 hours, each of those survival stories was a rare exception within an ocean of tragedy. More than 164,000 buildings across the region were completely destroyed or damaged beyond habitability, pushing more than 1,500,000 people out into freezing winter conditions. Try placing that number in a more tangible frame. It is equivalent to the entire population of Da Nang City simultaneously losing their homes in sub-zero temperatures with nowhere to go. The Turkish government declared a national state of emergency within hours and mobilized all military and civilian forces. But the scale of the catastrophe exceeded the response capacity of any system. In many areas of Hatay province, residents had to wait 72 hours or more before seeing any rescue team arrive, while their family members waited beneath the concrete layers. This was the consequence of a region completely severed from the rest of the country, because the only roads leading in had slid or collapsed, turning Hatay into an island in the middle of the mainland. The Mediterranean coastline of Hatay province was also permanently altered in less than 1 minute, with several coastal sections subsiding 1 to 2 meters below sea level due to tectonic plate displacement. The port of Iskenderun, one of Turkey's largest and busiest commercial ports, was severely damaged, and a massive fire broke out in the container storage yard that burned for more than 1 week. In the first days, more than 5,000 aftershocks occurred, including many exceeding 5.0 magnitude, continuously interrupting and endangering rescue operations across the entire affected zone. The ground surface near Kahramanmaraş shifted laterally by up to 6 meters at certain points along the fault, meaning the two sides of a road could be offset by the full length of a bus. This was no longer merely a geological event. This was the moment a region as large as half of Vietnam lost most of its infrastructure, housing, and emergency response capacity in a single morning. In Syria, the World Health Organization warned that the healthcare system of northern Syria, already near collapse after 12 years of civil war, was now completely unable to meet emergency needs. In a disaster already catastrophic enough, Syria faced a second layer of tragedy, having to rescue itself while diplomatically isolated, chronically underserved in humanitarian terms, and without the infrastructure to receive international aid. The humanitarian crisis in Syria rapidly exceeded what the United Nations called a disaster within a disaster, a situation where the existence of the first disaster had already destroyed the capacity to respond to the second. As the first week ended, the official death toll had surpassed 41,000 and was still climbing daily as rescue teams reached areas that had remained inaccessible throughout the week. Here is what the number 59,000 does not convey. Behind each of those numbers was a family losing its members, a community losing its doctors, teachers, and the tradespeople who had built that city over decades. The affected zone of approximately 350,000 square kilometers, equivalent to the entire stretch of central Vietnam, from Thanh Hoa to Binh Thuan, was designated as a disaster zone for many months to come. By the end of February 2023, the confirmed death toll in Turkey alone had surpassed 50,779, with the final figure projected to be even higher. And according to the United States Geological Survey and Turkey's Kandilli Earthquake Research Center, this was among the 3 highest energy earthquakes ever recorded in Turkey in the modern seismic measurement era. Total economic damage was estimated at more than $104 billion, equivalent to more than 10% of Turkey's entire annual gross domestic product, with many experts believing the true figure was substantially higher. The city of Antakya had to be almost entirely rebuilt from scratch, and Turkey launched one of the largest urban reconstruction programs in modern history, with the target of delivering new housing for millions of people within 1 year. However, the reconstruction process revealed a painful truth. Thousands of the collapsed buildings were permitted structures that had passed construction inspections, but were still not built to withstand an earthquake of this magnitude. More than 200 people connected to the construction industry were detained in Turkey in the weeks following the disaster, including contractors, supervising engineers, and building permit officials. This raised a question that Turkish citizens and the world could not avoid asking. Was this truly a natural disaster, or was it a human-made catastrophe hiding behind a natural geological event? Seismic engineers subsequently demonstrated that buildings that had genuinely complied with Turkey's 2007 seismic code survived at significantly higher rates, even in areas closest to the epicenter. In Syria, the post-disaster picture was far more complex, as the country had no single government capable of coordinating reconstruction, and millions of people were trapped within a crisis layered on top of a crisis. Millions of Syrians had to live in temporary tents and shelters for many months after the disaster, with no clear pathway to reconstruction, no financial resources, and no political stability. Scientists at the European Space Agency confirmed that the Earth's surface in the Kahramanmaraş region had shifted laterally by up to 6 meters in less than 1 minute, and this displacement was measurable from orbital satellites. This was the largest surface displacement recorded by Earth observation satellites in a single earthquake event since orbital seismic monitoring technology was developed, and it permanently reshaped the topography of the East Anatolia region. 11 months after the disaster, large areas of Antakya remained uncleared, and residents could not or would not return because the land had been declared unsafe for reconstruction. This 2,000-year-old city, once the most important commercial and cultural hub of the entire Eastern Mediterranean, faced the prospect of becoming a ghost city, where the heritage exists, but the population no longer does. This is the moment when the lesson of the Kahramanmaraş earthquake began to extend beyond Turkey's borders and became a lesson for the entire world. The 2023 earthquake fundamentally changed how Turkey approached seismic building standards, with sweeping new regulations enacted and inspection systems thoroughly reformed. The Turkish government committed to rebuilding more than 315,000 homes within 1 year, using higher seismic standards, creating one of the fastest urban reconstruction programs in recorded history. The earthquake also reignited global debate about early earthquake warning systems, because while no system can stop seismic waves, they can provide between 10 and 60 seconds of advance warning. 10 seconds may not seem long, but in those 10 seconds, you can take cover under a table, exit an elevator, move a patient off a surgical table, or stop a train before it enters a tunnel. Japan, the country with the world's most advanced earthquake early warning system, sent specialists to Turkey to assist in designing and deploying a denser seismic sensor network across the entire southern region. But early warning technology is only part of the answer, because even with 60 seconds of warning, poorly built structures will still collapse, and the people inside will still have nowhere safe to go. The real lesson of Kahramanmaraş is not only about geology, it is about the price paid when construction costs are cut on ground that can always shake, at any moment, without warning. Turkey is not the only country that needs to hear this lesson, because in Istanbul itself, a city of 15 million people, sitting less than 20 kilometers from the North Anatolian Fault, scientists have been warning of a major earthquake for decades. According to the Kandili Institute, the probability of an earthquake of 7.0 magnitude or greater occurring near Istanbul within the next 30 years is estimated at between 60 and 70%. Tehran, the capital of Iran, with 15 million residents, sits in an equally dangerous zone, also surrounded by faults accumulating stress, and also home to millions of buildings that do not meet seismic safety standards. Dhaka in Bangladesh, Kathmandu in Nepal, Lima in Peru, these cities all sit on accumulating fault systems and all face construction quality challenges similar to those of southern Turkey before 2023. And Vietnam, while not on the Pacific Ring of Fire, also has active fault systems in the northwest region and along some coastal zones sufficient to generate damaging earthquakes. The question that the Kahramanmaraş earthquake leaves behind is not whether these cities will experience seismic catastrophe, but whether they will be sufficiently prepared when it does. Because what Kahramanmaraş proved once again, not for the first time and not for the last, is that natural disasters do not distinguish between rich and poor, large city or small village. They distinguish only between those who were prepared and those who were not. The East Anatolian Fault did not stop accumulating energy after February 6th, though at a slower rate after releasing so much accumulated stress, it continues moving every single day beneath the surface. And more than 1 year after February 6th, hundreds of thousands of people from the affected region were still living in prefabricated temporary housing, waiting to return to cities being rebuilt from scratch. Children born in those temporary settlements will grow up in a city being rebuilt from nothing, and their parents' memories of the old city will gradually survive only in photographs and videos. 60 seconds. That is all the time the ground shook at 4:17 in the morning of February 6th, 2023. But the consequences of those 60 seconds continue shaping the lives of millions of people today. The land there still remembers that day, still carries its cracks and scars, and scientists know that pressure is beginning to build again, slowly and unstoppably, on adjacent fault segments that have yet to release. The story of Kahramanmaraş does not end here, because tens of thousands of survivors still carry the psychological trauma of that night, when their world collapsed in the most literal sense. The World Health Organization reported that post-traumatic stress disorder rates among the earthquake-affected population were significantly above normal levels, and the demand for mental health support far exceeded the region's available capacity. Thousands of schools were destroyed or damaged, and an entire generation of children across 11 Turkish provinces had to study in temporary tents, containers, or stopped studying entirely for months after the disaster. Agriculture in the region was also severely disrupted, as thousands of hectares of farmland were cracked and fractured, irrigation systems were destroyed, and the agricultural workforce was dispersed by the massive post-disaster population displacement. Hatay province, renowned for its olive production and traditional craftsmanship spanning thousands of years, saw much of its traditional production chain disappear, along with the elderly master craftspeople who did not survive. The earthquake triggered a much wider debate about uncontrolled urbanization rates in high seismic risk zones, not just in Turkey, but across the entire world. The global urbanization rate is placing ever more people in cities within high seismic risk zones, and according to the United Nations, more than 1 billion people worldwide are living in buildings that do not meet adequate seismic safety standards. But the most important lesson is not about technology or geology. It is about political and economic choices, because every substandard building is the result of a human decision somewhere in the chain, from design to construction to inspection. Kahramanmaraş reminds us that in geology there is no concept of an absolutely safe place, only places that are better prepared, and places that are not yet prepared enough. The site of Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire that existed 3,000 years ago on this same Anatolian land, was excavated from beneath the surface, and what archaeologists uncovered is evidence of civilizations that collapsed before on this very same ground. The ground of Anatolia shook before human records existed, has shaken throughout the entire history of human civilization and will continue shaking long after everything we build today has disappeared. The international community pledged more than $7 billion in humanitarian assistance in the first weeks following the disaster. But experts noted that even this amount covered only a fraction of the actual needs. Among all the lessons this earthquake leaves behind, perhaps the most important is the lesson about time. Because everything built on seismically hazardous ground is in a race against the geological clock. The East Anatolian Fault is now monitored by a network of more than 1,000 new seismic stations installed after the disaster, alongside European Space Agency SAR satellites tracking every millimeter of ground deformation daily. This is a story about 60 seconds, but it is also a story about 80 years of accumulation, about decades of construction decisions, and about thousands of years of people choosing to live on a land that has always known how to shake. And the question that we, watching this from any city in the world, need to ask ourselves is, what does the city we live in actually know about the ground beneath the buildings it stands on? 60 seconds. That is all the time the East Anatolian Fault needed to permanently change the lives of millions of people. And its story is not yet over, because the ground is still moving right now.